Today we're going to talk about culture. And culture is, if you remember back a few slide presentations ago when we were talking about the different disciplines in social science, you may remember that anthropology is the study of human culture. And that's true. And I think I said before that anthropology and sociology of all the social sciences are probably the most closely related in a lot of ways. And one of the reasons is they both focus a great deal on culture. Anthropology focuses on it perhaps even a bit more than sociology does, but it's an important concept in sociology too, so it's one that I want to take some time to introduce you to. And so the first question I guess you would ask is, what is culture? So let me give you a definition. This is what I think of as the definition of culture. Culture is all those ways of thinking, acting, feeling that are passed down from generation to generation. And you can pause if you'd like to write that down. Ways of thinking, acting, feeling, which are passed down from generation to generation. This picture that I put here obviously is a different culture perhaps than the one that you're used to. It doesn't look like American culture at all, but it is culture. There are ways of thinking, acting, feeling that they're expressing there in their native culture in Vanuatu or wherever they are. I think it is Vanuatu. Which is an island in the South Pacific, if you don't know where that is. But their culture is different from ours, but it is still just that same thing. It's those ways of acting and thinking that are passed down, and they learn those things from their ancestors, from their parents or their grandparents or whoever taught that to them. So that's what culture is. It's all of that stuff. And if you actually think about that definition, ways of thinking, acting, and feeling, that pretty much covers everything you do. One of those things is how you spend your day. Just as part of understanding what the word culture means in our society, I have to draw a distinction between what's known as elite and popular culture. This is using culture in a slightly more narrow way to talk about cultural events and that sort of thing. And when we talk about elite and popular culture, what we're talking about is the sort of cultural events, the sort of cultural entertainments that appeal to different socioeconomic classes of people. Elite culture is usually reserved for those in the upper classes, for rich people, in other words. So elite culture would look like, I don't know, maybe the symphony, the opera, the stuff that when people say, oh, I'm going to a cultural event, that's usually what they mean is elite culture, the kind of culture that would appeal to people in the upper social classes. Popular culture, on the other hand, is stuff that appeals to people in the middle and lower classes. So television, for instance, and, bringing it down even a bit, maybe something like Jerry Springer would be an example of popular culture. American Idol at the moment is popular culture. The music that's on the radio would be a good example of popular culture. The movies that you go see, the latest Tom Hanks movie or whatever, that's popular culture. So that's just another way of defining the word. And then finally, one last definition, the word society. We've thrown this around, so it's about time, I suppose, that we define it. A society, I had to talk about culture first because the definition of society contains culture. A society is a group of people who share a common culture and a common geographic area. That's why I put the globe up here, a geographic area meaning, a particular part of the globe that you share. So you could make the argument that most of the English-speaking parts of the world, the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, you share a very common culture. If you think about it, you listen to Canadian music. You don't even know when it is Canadian music a lot of times. You listen to British groups and you watch British television that's been adapted. American Idol, for instance, was a British show called Pop Idol before it came over here. Which is, that's why the Simon guy is there still. He was on the original show there in Britain. So we share a very common culture with people in other parts of the globe. We have the same popular culture anyway, and in a lot of ways, we share the same language, which is big part of culture. But we're not the same society. American society is distinct from British or Australian or Canadian society. And the reason is that we live in a common geographic area. We share the same little plot of land here that we call the United States. And so that's what makes us a society. Not only that we have the same culture, but we live in the same place physically. Okay, so I want to spend some time talking about the elements of culture. That we can break it down even further than ways of thinking, acting, and feeling. And there are several major elements that make up any culture. The first of those is symbols and language. And if you think about it, language, as I think I talked about before when we were talking about the symbolic interactionists, language is nothing more than symbols. If you don't understand the words that are coming through your speakers right now, they're meaningless to you. These words only mean something because you attach meaning to them. You've learned what they mean. And so those words that you hear are nothing more than symbols that stand for ideas in your mind. And so as I say these words, they bring up these ideas in your mind. So language is a big part of culture, as are other symbols. I put up a symbol here of a shirt. And you could probably, if you saw someone wearing this shirt, you could make some assumptions that they're telling you by wearing that symbol. It says Abercrombie, which is a store that's far too young for me to shop at, but that I hear appeals to young people, and it's a way of showing, I guess, that you can afford to spend $40 on a shirt, among other things. I'm drinking coffee. If you're wondering why the pauses, I have to keep my interest up by consuming lots of caffeine. I suggest you do the same while you listen, by the way. That's very helpful. Anyway, these symbols, such as the clothes we wear, the wedding rings that we have, or the friendship rings, or whatever, all these elements, the earrings that you wear in your ears, and what they tell other people about you, all of those things are determined by your culture. They're culturally defined. They're meaningless unless other people attach meaning to them. And if you leave your culture, if you go to another culture, if you go to China, they may not know what the Abercrombie name means. They may not understand that shirt is saying something about you if you're wearing it. Okay. One important concept is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. This has nothing to do with Star Trek. It's always the first question I get. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is just that. It's a hypothesis, an idea, a theory that was put forward. And what this theory says is that if you want to tell how important a particular concept is for a people, for a culture, look at how many words are in their language to describe that concept. So I put a picture here of some snow sled dogs, and in this part of the world, in North Carolina, we don't get a lot of snow. In fact, so far this year, we've only had one snow, I believe. And that's some years we have none, and even on a good year, you only get 2 or 3. This just isn't a part of the world that gets a lot of snow. And so if you think about how many words we have for snow, we have very few. We have the word snow, and you might say flurries. You may have heard of a blizzard, although you don't usually see one. You've probably heard of snowflakes and snow drifts, etc. But there's not that many words to actually describe the different kinds of snow. For instance, the kind of snow that packs, we'll just say, well, it's heavy snow, it's packed snow. Or the kind of snow that's very light and drifts around, well, we'll just say it's very light snow. But if you lived in Alaska, among the Inuit people there, the Eskimo people, they actually have upwards of 100 different words just to describe different kinds of snow. They have a different word for the packing kind. They have a different word for the kind that is light, as I was talking about. They have a different word for the kind that comes in sideways versus straight down. They have a different word for the how heavy the snow is, how heavily it's coming down, how early or late in the season it is, etc. They have hundreds of words for snow. And the reason is, obviously, they get a lot more of it. It's more important in their culture that they have lots of words to describe exactly the kinds of snow because they deal with it on a daily basis. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis said you can tell from that by looking at the number of words for snow in these two different languages that it's a much more important concept for people there in Alaska than it is for people in North Carolina, which makes perfect sense if you think about it. So if you look in our own language and look at things that we have lots of words for, then that will give you a clue as to which things might be very important in our culture. I would submit to you that things like entertainment, that there are lots of words dealing with entertainment. There are lots of words dealing with money, if you think about it, all of the words that we have. And also words dealing with time. I mean, if you think about all the words dealing with time, there are quite a few. Norms and values are a big part of culture. I couldn't find a good picture for norms, so that's Norm from Cheers, if you remember that old show. Norms and values are closely related in society, and they really form, in a lot of ways, the basis of what culture is. A value is something that is of value. It's hard to describe that word without explaining what it is. Values are things that are important to you. Values are things that you hold dear. And that's true on a personal level as also a societal level. So that's what a value is. It's those things that are important to you. A norm is nothing more than a rule. Norms are rules. That's a very easy definition. And these norms or rules serve to enforce our values. And so we come up with our norms or our rules to make sure that the things that are important to us are protected. And so in our society, for instance, as Americans, we value different things, but we also value some of the same things. We all value, for instance, freedom. That's a value that almost all Americans have. We like our freedom. And so we have lots of rules, we have lots of norms to make sure that our freedoms are protected. And so you have, rights if you're ever accused of a crime, and you have the right to move from state to state, and you have the right not to be imprisoned falsely. You have all kinds of rules and norms to enforce that value of freedom. Another value that we have is education. I think as Americans we do value education. Maybe in different amounts, but we do all value it. And so we have the norms to do with that we have free public education until you're 16 and that you're required to go to school to get that education. We have public schools, and so we have laws in effect that say tax money is going to be used to support those public schools, just like the one that you're sitting in now. And so that's kind of how norms and values go together. Values are those things we have decided are important. Norms are the laws or the rules that we have that enforce those values. Another element of culture is definitely what's called material culture or artifacts. These are the actual things that your culture produces, the objects, the material objects that are produced. And you can actually tell a lot about a culture by looking at the material objects that it makes. So if you look around the room where you are right now, I guarantee you will see lots of material culture, things that have been produced by your culture. And if you think about it for a minute, if you see a television, for instance, in the room where you are, or some sort of computer screen, that tells you something that is valuable or important to our culture. We like to be entertained, and we also like information. And so you can really tell a lot about a culture just by looking at the artifacts from that culture, the material objects that it produces. It tells you a lot about what its values are, what's important to it. If you think about it, the whole science of archaeology, where you're digging up artifacts from the past, you're trying to piece together from those artifacts what a past culture was like, what was important to it. So material culture there is founding the whole basis of archaeology, if you think about it. And then finally, I wanted to talk about an important concept called cultural lag. Cultural lag is the idea that technology in a culture, the tools of a culture, are always out in front of the norms and values of the culture. In other words, technology moves faster than the rest of culture. And what this leads to is called cultural lag, which means your laws, for instance, laws having to do with technology, are usually a few years behind the technology itself. So we have laws, or we have technology that, here's an iPhone, which was a new technology in 2007, that kind of was a game changer in a lot of ways. It was an object that a lot of people wanted, and it changed mobile computing to an extent. But really, in our society, we still act in a lot of ways as far as our laws like this is the technology of the day. Like telephones still look like this. And so if you look at the laws that are passed in Congress having to do with digital music and that sort of thing, and digital rights management and the production of or the distribution of video over the internet, we really don't have laws that reflect that technology yet. They still are are hung up on broadcast television and that sort of thing. Education is the same way. The norms that we have in education are not geared towards online classes or towards new technologies like you're experiencing right now. The laws in education are still very much supporting the traditional classroom model. This is cultural lag. It's when the technology of a culture, the tools of a culture, are moving out ahead of the rules that have to do with the governing of those tools. And it can be a problem because it can really hold people who are trying to use new technology back. That's what's meant by cultural lag. Okay, I want to look a little more closely at norms because norms are such an important part of culture. And these are the rules, just to remind you, these are the rules that enforce the things that are important to us, our values. And so there are actually different levels of norms. Not all norms are equal. And these different levels of norms have names. The lowest level of norm is called a folkway. A folkway is special because it's the weakest level of norm, and it's only carried out informally, usually by your peers. So if you break a folkway, this weakest level of norm, you break this rule that's called a folkway, the only thing that's going to happen to you is you're going to get some social disapproval from your peers. These are called informal sanctions because they're not carried out by legitimate authority. A legitimate authority is people like the police or the government. People who have, the society's backing to carry out laws. No, these informal sanctions are actually only carried out by people who are doing it as a hobby, if you will. So let me give you an example of breaking a folkway. If you go to class, to a college classroom, and you're a male, and you dress in a three-piece suit, and you have no reason for dressing in that three-piece suit other than just you felt like dressing that way. Or if you go as a woman in an evening gown, a black dress like you would wear to a cocktail party, and you have no reason for doing that other than you want to dress that way, you're probably going to get some funny looks from your classmates. You'll probably get some questions. Are you going to a funeral? Do you have a job interview? Why are you dressed that way? You're breaking a folkway. It's not normal to dress that way. See, in that word normal, it has the word norm in it. You're breaking a rule. It's an informal rule. Nobody's going to arrest you for wearing a suit to class, but you're going to get informal sanctions. You're going to get people looking at you funny. You're going to get people asking you why you're dressed that way. So that's what a folkway is, and it's the weakest level of norm. The second level of norm is called a moray. And a moray is stronger than a folkway because it involves morality. If you break a moray, some people at least, would see that as an immoral act. You're doing something immoral when you break a moray. It's still only carried out informally. In other words, you're not going to be arrested for breaking this moray. But people are actually going to be a little more cold to you. They're going to act like you're being an immoral person if you break this norm. So, for instance, wearing a bathing suit or shorts into church might be seen as breaking a moray. It's actually not just inappropriate; it might be seen as being immoral. Spitting on the floor of a church, that might be seen as immoral. You'd be breaking a moray. Spitting on the ground outside, you might get a disapproving look. You'd be breaking a folkway. If you do it inside of a church building or another religious place, that might be seen as being immoral. And so you'll get even meaner looks, and you might be asked to leave, and you might be told, that is disrespecting the church. And so that would be more serious. That would be a moray. And there's lots of other things that you can think of that act itself would be seen as immoral. If so, you're breaking a moray. The strongest level of norm is actually called a law. And a law is special because it is carried out. The sanctions that enforce this norm are carried out by legitimate authority. People like the police or the government. So you all know what laws are. These are things that are actually written down. So they're a very strong level of norm because they expect you to follow it. And if you don't, you can get put in jail and that sort of thing. So obviously it's a very strong norm. So not killing other people is an example of a law. And if you break that law, you're going to face serious consequences carried out by those legitimate authorities. One last thing that's technically not a level of norm, but it's a special kind of norm that involves things that are so repugnant to members of society that they're called taboos. And if you break this particular rule, this particular norm, you may not only face sanctions, you may actually be thrown out of society. You might actually be shunned by the rest of society. So in our society, an example of a taboo is eating human flesh. And so if it's found out that you're a cannibal, you're probably never going to be fully accepted into human society again if people find that out about you. Being a pedophile, obviously, is another one. Incest, having sexual relations with a close member of your family. These are things that you don't really, if you enter into those by choice, if you break that norm, that taboo by choice, you're likely to be shunned by society, to never be accepted again. So that's a special kind of norm called a taboo. Okay, cultural attitudes, what I'm getting at here, let me bring up the first one, are ways of looking at other cultures, attitudes about other cultures. Ethnocentrism is the belief that your culture is the most important, and it's the one that all other cultures should be judged by. So if you're being ethnocentric, then you say things like, well, American culture is the very best, we're number one, and if the rest of the world doesn't like it, well, there's something wrong with them. We have the ultimate, the best. We are the best. We are the best that there could ever be and has ever been, and everybody else is judged by how close they are to our culture. That's a very ethnocentric way of looking at things. It's putting your own culture at the center of things and judging everyone else completely by how close they are to your culture. And the closer they are to your culture, the better they are. That's known as ethnocentrism, and it's a force. It can be a very positive force, actually. It leads to things like pride in your own culture. It can make you want to improve your own culture, to keep that lead that you have and to make it even better than it already is. It can bring you together as a people, because, for instance, as Americans, you can say, we're all Americans and we all share this great culture. So it has some very positive things, but it can also be negative, obviously, in that it leads to making other cultures feel inferior, and that other cultures don't like feeling inferior any more than you do. And so it makes you seem arrogant. It makes you seem like you're not taking other parts of the world into account. And when you're dealing with other parts of the world, which of course is a necessity in our modern society, in our modern reality, it can lead to some resentment. And obviously that can lead to things like war and distrust and terrorism and all of the other things. You have to remember that the terrorists on 9/11 were also ethnocentric. They were just ethnocentric towards their own culture and their own religion rather than ours. So that was actually an act of ethnocentrism as well, the bringing down of the Twin Towers. So ethnocentrism has some good things and some bad things. Xenocentrism is the exact opposite in a lot of ways of ethnocentrism. Xenocentrism is the belief that there's something better just because it's foreign or just because it's different. In other words, that other cultures are better than your own just because they're foreign. This is harder to understand in a lot of ways. Americans say, "Well, we're not xenocentric at all. We don't think that foreign things are better," but we do. We do it with products, particularly. The best sports cars in the world, Lamborghini, Ferrari. Maybe they're better, but maybe they're better because they have that nameplate and they're Italian. Or the best wines in the world. You could say, well, Californian, but Ernest and Julio Gallo are not the same as a fine Bordeaux from France. The best wines in the world come from France. And a lot of times, just because it has that French label, you think it's better. And so that's xenocentrism, that belief that just because something is foreign, it's somehow more exotic, it's better. than something that's made here in the United States. You know, Belgian or Swiss chocolates are better than chocolates made in Wisconsin because they're foreign, and you've heard of Belgian or Swiss chocolates. That's xenocentrism. Kind of on the other end of doing things in a centric way with culture is the idea of cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is the belief that all cultures are equal, that no culture is better than any other. And it's relativistic. In other words, you take each culture on its own merit. It's hard to be totally cultural relativistic, though, because if you really want to be cultural relativistic, you have to say that all cultures really are equal and that the practices of any culture are as good as any other. So the practice of Nazi Germany of exterminating the Jews, yeah, nothing wrong with that. Or the practice of infanticide that's still practiced in parts of rural China, because that's part of the culture there, to kill female babies. This is not done nearly as widely as it once was, but it is still done. Also, in some tribes in the Amazon, infanticide is still practiced. So if you're okay with taking a baby as soon as it's born and bashing its head in, and you say, oh, well, that's just part of their culture, that's what you really have to do to be a true cultural relativist. You have to say all elements of all cultures are equal and can only be understood on their own merits. So it's hard to do that. Most people will fall somewhere on a continuum, on a scale between being culturally relevant, to cultural relativistic, and being ethnocentric. And you know, saying no other cultures have anything redeeming at all, only our culture is worthwhile. Most people are somewhere on a line between those two, having pride in their own culture, but also realizing that other cultures can have things that are worthwhile. Okay, and then finally, the last thing we'll talk about is cultural diversity. Within our culture, there are subcultures. These are cultures that exist within the larger culture, but have their own norms and values and beliefs and etc. A good example of a subculture would be, for instance, a book club. That book club has its own meetings, you know, and they have their own rules and they have their own way of doing things. And so they have their own norms and values that are associated with that club that belong to. That would be an example of a subculture. Or perhaps if you're a gamer, if you're someone who likes playing computer games, you know that gamers have their own language, they have their own way of doing things, they have their own vocabulary when they're talking about games, their own norms and values about what to look for in a game and that sort of thing. Subcultures are just these different groups that exist within the larger culture. And so you probably belong to several subcultures. You know, if you're a soccer mom, that's a subculture. If you know, and you know all about what it means to be a soccer mom. If you're a goth, you know, if you're a person who dresses in goth clothing, that's a subculture. It has its own norms and values and its own rules for how to do things. So that's what that's talking about. Don't get subcultures confused with countercultures. Subcultures exist peacefully within the larger culture. Within American society, there are lots of these subcultures, and they don't hurt anything. They just exist peacefully within the culture. Countercultures, though, are actually counter to the larger culture. Their norms and values conflict with the larger culture, and so they are or can be harmful. So militia groups, for instance, are a counterculture. Gangs are a counterculture, you know, street gangs. The Hells Angels might be an example of a counterculture. Street gangs obviously are a good example of a counterculture because if you think about the norms and values of a street gang, they have norms and values, but very often those norms and values are against the laws of the larger culture. They may involve theft or sometimes even murder, as part of the norms and values of that gang, and obviously those conflict with the larger American society. And so countercultures are different from subcultures because their very existence, their very norms and values conflict with the larger culture that contains them. And then finally, the last thing we'll talk about is ideal versus real culture. Ideal culture is culture as you would like it to be. It's when if you were entertaining a foreign guest and you were explaining to them what it meant to be an American, you'd talk about freedom and equality and everybody having the chance to succeed and everyone having the chance to achieve financial success and have the right to health and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. That's your ideal culture. It's your idea of what American culture should be. Real culture is just that. It's real American society with all its problems, with the stratification we have, the extremely rich and the extremely poor, and the poverty and the disease and the parts of our culture that we're not very proud of, that lead to murder and lots of gun violence and crime and all of those other things. That's our real culture, and there's a gap between our ideal and our real culture. We need that ideal culture because you need something to strive for. As a society, you're constantly trying to get your real culture to match up more and more with your ideal culture. And so that's why we have that. The bigger the gap between your ideal and your real culture, the more you're living in a dream world, the more you're living in a fantasy world. And the closer those two things are, the closer you are to having a society that functions very well. So that's the difference there, and I think that's all we have to say about culture. Thanks for listening.